Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch, and welcome to the third session of the certificate series. In this session, we'll be focusing on convolutional neural networks, at least for the first half. We'll be talking about some intuition that we've built in the previous session. And in the second half, Arvindra will introduce some applications on medical imaging and some other variants of convolutional neural networks as well. And so with that, let's get started. In this first half, we'll be trying to understand why we need convolution operations in neural networks. We'll also get to understand what are some of the important convolutional neural network specific hyperparameters that we need to pay attention to. We'll also be looking at the different variants of convolutional neural networks. I'll just see CNNs for short. It's a mouthful. And we'll also finally be looking at some of the online resources that you could refer to. Great, let's get started with convolutions. If you haven't gone through this tutorial already, TensorFlow has a very simple tutorial that I highly recommend you go through. They basically build a neural network to train train it on the MNIST dataset. The MNIST dataset is also another popular toy dataset in machine learning. It's a dataset of handwritten digits. And what they do is they start with an image representation, a 28 by 28 pixel representation of the handwritten number, together with its true label. And they flatten this image into a one-dimensional vector. So 28 by 28 is 784 one-dimensional values. And this vector then acts as an input to the network. They don't have hidden layers in this case, so they go straight to an output layer with a softmax activation, as we've seen in the previous session with the iris dataset. And then they use cross entropy for loss and gradient descent as an optimizer, as we've seen as well. And it's always good to be in the habit of making sure that the math is right and your matrix multiplications work and so on. But let's take a closer look at this image, and let's bring down the resolution a little bit so we can understand what's going on. If we perform the same flattening on this image to obtain a vector, in the simple world we would end up with something like that in terms of a binary representation. And we notice here that the 7 is well behaved. It's nice and centered on the image. Now what happens if the 7 is somewhere towards one corner of the image? And so the vector representation will look something like that. And so even though they are both 7s, the inputs to the network are really completely different. And this approach is really not scalable if our network needs to learn about 7s in the middle and 7s in each corner and every possible position in the image for that matter. And so clearly we need a different solution. And we need a way of sharing parameters so that 7s are identified wherever they are on the image. And this is essentially what a convolutional neural network is. It's a neural network that shares parameters across space. The question now is, how big of a patch or a convolutional kernel or filter should we use? Well, I mean, if the filter is the same size as the input, then that would be no different than a normal neural network where we don't have any parameter sharing. But if we make it smaller, then we have much fewer weights to learn, and we can actually share them. So let's go with this 3 by 3 filter. Now the values or the weights in this filter is what our network will learn as we train it. Let's assume that the network learned that this specific filter looks for diagonal lines that go upwards from left to right. And when we then move the filter systematically and perform a convolutional operation across the image from left to right and top to bottom, And we perform element-wise multiplications between the values in the filter and the input location that we're currently on the image. And this outputs a feature map that is usually slightly smaller in terms of length and width due to the than the input, due to the nature of the convolutions. And as you can imagine, the output of this multiplication will be 0 if the input is empty. So you can see it over here in this instance. The output will have some signal if there are some non-zero pixels at that location. So you can say here on the top. And the output will also have a very strong signal if that same feature, that same diagonal is captured. And eventually the feature map will look something like that, where you have a specific feature, the diagonal in this case, that is highly accentuated. And so under the hood, what is really happening is very simple element-wise multiplications that look like that. So you have your filter in yellow, the weights of the filter are in red. And you can see that the weights in the filter don't change because they're shared across the entire image. And multiplications are then added up, and you get one scalar value per convolution. Okay, let's take another example. Let's take the letter A, and let's assume that the network has learned 3 different convolutional filters: diagonal going up, diagonal going down, and a straight line. We can then imagine that the feature maps will look something like that, where the respective features are accentuated. And if we use the flashlight analogy here, then what we've done is converted a given patch of the input into 3 scalar values, and each value corresponds to a specific feature. And you could also see it as a vector, where this patch is converted into a one-dimensional representation. Now let's step back and look at the input image as a whole. You will see that the image now has depth and also has shrunk a little bit in terms of length and width due to the convolutions. And if we repeat this process over and over, extracting features, then we'll end up with sort of a vector in a way. And then and only then we can apply a classifier like a neural network, as we've seen earlier in the MNIST example, and we can be sure that the spatial relationships in the image are not lost. As we've introduced convolutions, and we now have translational invariance together with weight sharing. And so now that we understand how convolutions work, let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's look at the history of convolutional networks and how they've come to be, of how we know them today. Probably one of the first appearances of something like a convolutional network was in the 80s by Fukushima, and his new cognitron was probably the first iteration of a CNN, where this idea of weight sharing was introduced. And I stress here on the title of the paper, unaffected by shift imposition. So this was clearly something they were trying to solve at that time. The new cognitron was based on a very simple idea of simple and complex cells. The simple cells performed the convolutions, and complex cells performed pooling, which we will get to shortly. Unfortunately, there was no killer application, so it didn't really catch on at that time. And it wasn't until Jan LeCun in the late 90s came up with LeNet 5, which surprisingly has a very similar architecture to many CNNs that we use today. And this network had the killer application. So it was actually used by several banks to recognize handwritten numbers on checks at that time. And then came AlexNet in 2012. This specific paper was cited over 26,000 times, I believe. And the paper is arguably one of the major reasons why we're here today talking about deep learning. Again, surprisingly, a very similar structure to LeNet. They introduced the ReLU activations that we saw in the previous session. They started to train their networks on GPUs, which was uncommon at that time. So they're able to slash the training time from weeks to 6 days. But more importantly, they were able to test their model on very large data set thanks to ImageNet. And so ImageNet is an image recognition competition that started in 2010, and the task is to train on 1.2 million images labeled with the 1,000 classes. And AlexNet was able to beat the reigning champion by a very significant margin of 10.9, 11%. And then the rest is history after that. All right, so now we have a little bit of history. So let's look at hyperparameters that are specific to convolutional neural networks. Probably the most obvious one is the number of filters, right? And the idea here is to give your input image more and more depth, i.e., extract more and more features. And so the number of convolutions usually increases as you move forward through the network. We use a base of 2 here, just for easier memory calculations, and to make memory calculations easier, and we'll see that in a bit. Filter size is another important hyperparameter. We usually use odd filter sizes with input images of even dimensions. So this way we don't end up, with an extra odd column during convolutions. And generally we know that smaller filter sizes usually lead to better results. It's also common for networks to start with a larger filter size and have subsequently smaller ones. We then have the padding and stride. And so padding is where an image is padded with zeros either on the top or on the left side or on all 4 sides. We also have stride, which is the number of pixels to shift the convolution filter during the operation. And so we also know that smaller strides work better in practice because they give more overlap, so you tend to understand spatial representations better. And these 2 hyperparameters work together, so they should be adjusted simultaneously. The arithmetic is very simple, but it's just sometimes confusing. So for instance, if we decide not to pad our image, but have a stride of 2, and so on a 5x5 input, we end up with a 2x2 feature map. Now let's assume that we keep the stride fixed at 2 and add padding all around the image. And you can see here how the output size obviously would change as a result. If we keep the padding and change the stride, bring it down to 1, you get obviously a different output as well. And so with the exception of this last example, we can see that strides can be used to downsample our input image. However, this is a kind of a very aggressive way to downsample images. And this is why most convolutional layers will have a pooling layer right after them. And that's why we have pooling essentially. And so this way we can have a stride of 1 where we're shifting the filter by 1 pixel, giving us maximum overlap, and then apply pooling to the feature maps. Pooling comes in multiple flavors. The most common are maximum pooling and average pooling. And pooling is really great because number 1, it does the dimensionality reduction for us. It is accurate. It does not add parameters. It doesn't have any weight, so it does not add parameters to the network. But obviously, it comes with computational cost. And the other downside to it is that we have more hyperparameters to tune. So we need to set the size and the stride, both the size and the stride of the pooling window. The type of pooling that you will use will again depend on your data. If you tend to have darker features on brighter backgrounds, then an average pooling might work better for you. And the opposite is also true. If you end up with max pooling, which works better with darker backgrounds. And so eventually we have convolutions, followed by pooling as illustrated here. You have fully connected layers where there is no weight sharing as a regular neural network that follow towards the end, and you end up with a classification. And so the way you might consider it is that convolutions and pooling perform perception while the fully connected layers perform the cognition. So these are kind of the two major components of CNNs. Now the final pooling layer might not give you a perfect one-dimensional vector. I guess in this case it is an n-dimensional length and width at the last pooling layer. And so what is usually done is that this last pooling layer is flattened as is and passed on to the fully connected layers. Now another common practice, which I guess is also common to other machine learning methods, is data augmentation. And data augmentation becomes really important with neural networks generally because they help us increase the data size, training data size, and eventually avoid overfitting. But another thing that they do is that they help us with translational scale invariance and other translations. Think, for instance, rotation. And this is something that when we looked at translation with the 7 in the beginning, we were only looking at translational invariance, not rotation or scale. You can either do them beforehand on your entire data set, but you can also do online data augmentation, where the augmentation is happening on the fly during training. You also need to choose the techniques that work well with your data. And so, for instance, with medical images, flipping might not work as it produces anatomically inaccurate results. So your network might be seeing an image that is not really possible. And so before training, it's always a good habit to keep an eye on the number of parameters in your network. So let's take this example. We have an input image of 32 by 32 pixels. And we have 8 by 8 convolutional filters, and we have 20 of them. And let's assume we have a padding of 1. That's what you see in dotted lines there, and a stride of 2. We don't have to do the math, but this will give us 20 14 by 14 feature maps. Now, let's assume, just for argument's sake, that this convolution is a fully connected convolution. So we do not have weight sharing. This means that each node in the convolutional filter will be connected to each node in the feature map. Now let's count the number of parameters, the weights and biases, and see what that gives us. So we have 8 by 8 nodes, and we have one channel. It's assuming it's a grayscale image, and we have one bias per convolutional filter. And then we have 14 by 14 nodes in each feature map, and we have 20 of those. So we have 250K parameters in just one single convolutional layer. Now let's do the actual calculation where we do have weight sharing. And in this case, each filter is shared across each entire feature map. And here we just need to count actually the nodes in the convolutional filter. And this gives us 1300. And so it really becomes evident how this concept of weight sharing is a crucial component of CNNs. And this is obviously just happening over a single layer. So it's really important to run the similar calculation for all your layers. And this is one of the popular networks, the VGG network from the Oxford Visual Geometry Group. I think it came in second place in the ImageNet competition, I think 2015. So keeping track of your parameter count across the network can really help you identify bottlenecks. So for instance, you can see here that the number of convolutions or the number of parameters in this first fully connected layer is around 102 million parameters just on its own. So that might be something you would want to do something about. Another thing to keep track of is memory usage. So we have here calculated memory usage per a single input image. We can see on top here that the input image is 224 by 224, and there are 3 channels. It's an RGB image. And so the total memory here is 24 million floats, and we assume 4 bytes per float, and that gives us around 93 MBs per image. Let's just say 100 megabytes per image. And now assume we're using this GPU to train our model. This GPU has 4 GB of memory. So what would be a good number for this for the batch size? How many images can we fit into this GPU without running out of memory? So each image needs 100 megabytes, and you might think, okay, well, it's 4 GB, that's 4,000 MB, so we're looking at what, 40 images? Well, not quite, because we need another 100 megabytes per image for the backward pass as well. And so we cannot release the memory until we've performed both the forward and the backward propagations. So in this case, we need 200 megabytes per image. And so a possible batch size for in this case would be 20 images. And so after training, another important question to ask is, is my network learning the right features, basically? And one basic approach to this is to systematically move a solid patch across an image and identify areas where within this image where that gray patch causes the correct label probability to drop. And you can see it here in the case of wheel on the right, or the hound in this heat map here as well. And that tells us that the areas in blue have contributed the most to the prediction of the network. Another more sophisticated method is class activation mapping. And what you do here is you back propagate from your prediction layer to the final convolutional layer. And this is where all the spatial relationships are preserved before you've flattened it and passed it to the fully connected layers. And what you do is you identify the nodes that contribute the most change to one or more classes. And this allows you to generate heat maps across multiple classes as shown in this example. All right, let's switch on to talking about different variants of convolutional neural networks. One of the most interesting ones is in the introduction of one-by-one convolutions. This might not seem intuitive at first because one-by-one convolutions understand almost nothing about spatial relationships. But what happens is that if you place a one-by-one convolution within a larger convolution layer, and so we move from having a linear classifier over the patch to a mini two-layer neural network. And so this is kind of an inexpensive way to make the network deeper. As one-by-one convolutions, they introduce relatively few parameters into the network, and the calculations are just simple matrix multiplications, so it is not that expensive. And the Inception modules became really popular. They won first place in ImageNet in 2014. The idea here is that you would eventually need to decide on as we've seen, on a convolutional filter size, and the authors think here is like, well, why not just use all of them? And the Inception module does exactly that. So the idea is to let the neural network learn and automatically select the most useful convolutional filter size. And so when the one-by-one convolutions come before a 3x3 or a 5x5 convolutions, they actually help with dimensionality reduction and everything that we've mentioned in the previous slide. However, when one-by-one convolutions happen independently, as in this case here, what they're doing is that they're looking at cross-channel correlations. So if you have an image, like an RGB image with multiple channels, then a one-by-one convolution is ignoring everything in terms of spatial orientation in the length and width, and it's looking at the depth in terms of channels. And that might be an interesting feature that you might want to capture. Okay, so now we know that CNNs learn increasingly higher level features. So your first layer might learn simple shapes and edges, very abstract concepts. Second layer, if it's a facial recognition network, the second layer might look into eyes, nose, ears, and so on. And your final third layer will detect the presence of these components and eventually recognize a face. But not necessarily in the correct spatial arrangement. So given the right circumstances, both these images can be recognized as a face by a convolutional neural network. And the same also applies with rotations, viewing angles, and shadows. Now, the pooling operation does help with this spatial understanding, as it forces the CNN to expect eyes to be in a specific location, and so on and so forth. But arguably, a lot of information is lost because the pooling windows are not overlapping, as we've seen. Jeffrey Hinton made this an AMA, Ask Me Anything, on Reddit a few years ago, and said that the pooling in CNNs was a big mistake, and the fact that it works is actually a disaster. And so last year, him and his students, I guess, published Capsule Networks, and the key idea here is that the representation of objects in the brain, not that we understand exactly how the brain works, but the representation of objects in the brain does not depend on a view angle. And they looked at how that could be translated to neural networks. And so capsule networks essentially, they essentially nest a layer within a layer. And so they're increasing the width of the network and not the depth. So this allows for a better allows for a detailed pose information that the network understands and learns. Things like object position, rotation, skewness, size, and so on. The authors also introduced layer-based squashing, essentially applying activations over an entire layer as opposed to over a single node. They also do replace the pooling with what they call routing by agreement, where lower level nodes will send their outputs to higher level nodes with similar output. And so I encourage you to look into it if that sounds interesting to some of the work you're working on. Another interesting architecture is residual nets, or ResNets, and this one won the ImageNet competition in 2015. So we know that deep networks are hard to train because of the vanishing gradient problem. That's the excessive multiplications that happen towards the beginning of the network, as we've seen with backpropagation. And as a result, the performance gets saturated and starts to degrade. And so to address this, the authors of the residual nets introduce so-called identity shortcut connections that skips one or more layers. And the best explanation I've found for this, to why this actually works, is in this figure. And as you can see, these shortcut connections on the left can also be viewed as a series of shorter mini networks if you unravel them. And these short paths can actually carry the gradient throughout the extent of very deep networks without having it vanish towards the end or the beginning of the network. And so this is also another interesting architecture to look out for. Another one is fully convolutional networks, and these are very popular with tasks that require image outputs. So think image segmentation. There are no fully connected layers. What you essentially do is you perform convolutions to downsample the image, and then you upsample it back to the original size. Now, in the process, you lose some resolution because of the downsampling, and therefore, to add back some of the resolution, the authors have added these activations from the previous layers, which they called skip connections. Just to bring back some of the resolution that was lost during the downsampling. This fully convolutional architecture was later extended to UNet, which is a popular medical imaging segmentation network. For those of you taking the workshop tomorrow, we'll also be having a segmentation tutorial. And the UNet also introduces another interesting feature where data beyond the image is extrapolated by mirroring, and this allows for segmentations that touch the edge of the image, as in these electron microscopy images. Another version is the VNet, which is also used for medical image segmentation. This works with 3D volumes. It combines both the UNet architecture with its skip connections, together with residual learning from the ResNet. And as you can see it here, that residuals are being introduced into the network, but also added after the convolutions. Another popular architecture is the generative adversarial networks, or GANs for short. And these networks involve the training of two networks, or two mini networks simultaneously. We have a generator and a discriminator. The generator attempts to generate fake images from a latent vector, and the discriminator attempts to spot the real from the fake images. And the goal here is to achieve Nash equilibrium between these two networks so that one does not overpower the other. And this can be illustrated here, where you have the real data distribution in black, dotted black lines, and the generator's distribution in green, together with the discriminator in blue. And the goal is to have the generator match the distribution of the real data as much as possible. And at this point, the generator and discriminator would have reached a stage where no further improvements on both sides is possible. And as you can imagine, convolutions have also been introduced to GANs, so you end up with DCGANs. And these authors in this specific paper were able to use the trained discriminator for image classification tasks. And this is very interesting because GANs essentially are used for unsupervised learning tasks. So this becomes interesting if you have unlabeled data. And it has also shown competitive performance with some other supervised algorithms. So I encourage you to also take a look at this paper. Some of the uses so far, any kind of cool generative deep learning network that you see on Twitter is probably produced by a generative adversarial network. Practical uses, it has been shown to be used in super resolution, so you're enhancing the resolution of a low-res image, but also because it's multimodal in nature, it allows us to do things like text-to-image synthesis. So imagine generating descriptions based on an image and vice versa. And finally, for completeness, we also have variational autoencoders. Now, autoencoders by design, they compress the input into a latent vector and decode it back. And then the loss is then comparing how accurate this reconstruction is. And so it falls under the self-supervised learning, as there are essentially no labels, but these labels can be inferred from the input image. And so we don't need to tell the network that this is a 4, essentially, because by understanding the latent vector representation, we can clearly cluster where all the 4s are and where all the 6s are and so on. Now, the interesting part about the variational autoencoders is that they do not encode the image into a single vector, but rather 2 vectors, one for mean values and one for standard deviation values. So we essentially have a vector of distributions. And this allows the decoder, which handles decoding the image, to be exposed to a much wider range of variations of encoding the same input image. And this kind of network has shown utility in compression and denoising tasks as well. All right, finally we move to resources. And I've chosen to include transfer learning under resources because I believe that most likely you would be going to start with a pre-trained model for your efforts and as you experiment with your data. And the reason why transfer learning works so well is really the increasingly higher level of features that CNNs learn that we've touched on earlier. And so if you're training on dogs and wolves in this case, the lower level features that we see in this first hidden layer here are features that are shared amongst a lot of images, including medical images. And so the concept here is that they can be recycled or they can be reused, especially given the scarcity of collecting medical images and annotating and curating them. And so in transfer learning, you first need to decide, well, which features are transferable and which features can I use, right? And then after that, you essentially have three choices. You could either fix the features that you want, and you can fine-tune the remaining features. So what you're essentially doing is you're starting from the weights that the model authors have stopped training at. And another approach would be to randomly initialize the remaining layers. So let's say you wanted to change the architecture of the pre-trained model, or you wanted to add more layers, or maybe you're performing a classification on a different number of classes. So that means that you need to change the architecture while still using the earlier features. The final choice is essentially getting rid of everything else that you don't need and simply using the network as a feature extractor. You can take these features, you can do some dimensionality reduction, PCA or TSNE, or you can do some traditional machine learning approaches that you're maybe more familiar with, like support vector machines or random forest, or even a neural network. And there are really multiple robust pre-trained models that one can go for. And you see that most of them are ones that have achieved the highest rankings in the ImageNet competition. So really, ImageNet as a benchmarking competition has really done a lot in this field. All right, online resources. These are two books that I highly recommend looking at. They offer both high-level intuition and kind of a technical dive. One is a book by Ian Goodfellow and colleagues, and the other is by Michael Nielsen, and they're both online and free. There are two other online courses by Coursera. The first is by Andrew Ng, and it's actually a collection of 5 different sub-courses. And the second one is by Jeffrey Hinton. Again, both of them are free. And finally, another 2 online courses. The first one is a very popular CS231 class at Stanford. Lots of great material. And then the second one is a Udacity Introduction to Deep Learning. And again, both of them are available free of charge. And so the final thing I'd like to touch on is reproducibility. And in the past few years, we've seen an explosion of deep learning applications within medical imaging. And a major contribution to this is really the availability of open source tools. And this is in contrast to expert systems in the 90s and the 2000s, where a lot of the tools were proprietary and usually commercial. Tools like these have kind of lowered the barriers to entry. A lot of these tools are developed by big tech giants, completely open source. And these tools also allow you to recreate the state-of-the-art networks with very, very few lines of code. So lowering the barrier, and that's all great. But you know, as they say, great power comes great responsibility. And so we often find it actually very difficult to reproduce other works simply because code implementations are not made available. So you end up with these hit and miss or low-hanging fruit implementations that apply a state-of-the-art network to some niche problem with very, very poor reproducibility. And so almost all these tools that we've looked at host their own so-called model zoos, and these zoos are very valuable because they contain a lot of pre-trained models. However, a lot of them lack running instructions. They lack pre- and post-processing pipelines that are required to process the images before they're fed into the network, and they mainly just focus on photographic images. GitHub is a hosting service for software version control. A lot of authors choose to make their implementations, put their implementations on GitHub, and that's also kind of a hit and miss. You have a very wide range of documentation rigor, which means that the re-implementation is non-trivial. So there are some existing resources, and these include NiftyNet and DLTK. These are libraries that are built on top of TensorFlow, and they provide kind of convenience functionalities for processing medical images. And so a medical image specific function that you will not find in a general purpose library like TensorFlow or others, these will be existing there. And these also host their own model zoos. Two other resources relatively new is TOMAT and DeepInfer. TOMAT is used for volumetric segmentations, and DeepInfer is for image-guided therapy. And both these provide 3D slicer modules that allow you to interact with them. One project that our lab is involved in is Model Hub, and so the idea is to develop a software sharing template for AI researchers to share fully reproducible and portable implementations of their efforts. And so for Model Hub, we work with models that are based on published manuscripts. The platform is open source, so we give authors freedom of choice of the license of their liking. We acknowledge that researchers will have preferences when it comes to tools, so we're thinking of the platform as being tool agnostic. We rely on Dockers for portability. Docker is an infrastructure for portable software environments. And really, user experience and simplicity are really key here. And this is especially in acquiring a user base that might not be entirely technical. And so we work with authors. We focus on inference as a start. And we integrate their models together with pre- and post-processing pipelines and sample test files as well. And we offer 3 means of interacting with this model. You could either test drive it in the browser to actually see what it does before deciding if it fits your needs. More advanced users can access it through notebooks. And for developers, we also have an API, and you can use this API to, you can actually use the model out of the box and simply make API calls to get a specific prediction without really knowing much about the domain expertise that went into developing the model. So that's on the user side. On the contributor side, we work with authors to set up the software environment. We then organize their model-specific files into the template, and if our integration tests are all passed, then the model is added to the Model Hub registry, and displays. Okay, so to give you a rough idea, this is our test drive mode. Here we have general information about the model and associated papers, paper with licenses. We also integrate multiple open source model viewers to understand the layers in the network. And here we have a few sample images. In this case, right ventricle segmentation and MRI. Also with the ability to test on your own images. And finally, we also have notebooks for more advanced users where users can interact with the model in a standard Python API that is standardized across all models. And so for Model Hub, this is really a call for contributions. We offer full co-authorship for anyone who has published models and willing to share the model with us. Thank you very much.